like we said before, and we're hoping that people that didn't make it here tonight or are coming late will be able to use the recording to engage afterwards. I do want to give a gracious thank you, and I hope you all will join me with a round of applause for Habitat for Humanity for hosting us tonight. I want to thank Alan Ferguson, the president and CEO of Habitat for Humanity, for helping us host you all in this very important conversation as we make history in the city of Atlanta. With that, I will go ahead and give it over to our host for tonight, who will get us started, and we might have some special guests popping in and joining us, and we'll announce them as they come in. All right.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Kieta Holmes, and I am the Director of the Office of Zoning and Development. Sure. We still have people registering in person, and so we will start probably in about 2 to 3 minutes. Just hold all of your comments and conversation, and we'll get started as soon as possible.
Thank you, Kieta. I do stand up in my spare time, so I'm open to do a stand-up routine if you would like. Okay, no? All right. We have 105 participants in the virtual audience. Welcome, everyone, again. If you missed the housekeeping at the top, we'll just remind you that your microphones are muted for the duration of the meeting, but we invite you to ask your questions and make comment using the chat box feature. We will get started momentarily as we're allowing the rest of the in-person audience to join us.
Yeah.
If you are just coming in the room, there are seats at the very front row. We do not bite. Also, we're not close enough to bite you at that row.
Are you from the?
Had a big line.
If we started.
Well, the other thing, I mean, well, no, I mean.
Zoom audience, welcome in. It looks like our in-person audience are filling in the seats. And I just want to remind you all that if you are looking for the Atlanta Zoning Rewrite Focus Workshop, the very first of a 4-part series, you are in the right place. Thank you for doing what you had to do to participate tonight. We are at 126 participants in the room and growing. My name is Whitney Fuller. I am your friendly neighborhood community engagement manager. I'm a cousin of Spider-Man, and I'm here to welcome you all to the zoning rewrite update. You will have noticed by now that your microphones are muted, and they will remain muted for the duration of the meeting. We will have halfway through the presentation an opportunity for questions and answers. We'll prioritize the first question from our in-person audience and alternate with our virtual audience. Although you won't be able to come on the microphone, I will audibly ask your questions aloud. And if we don't have enough time to answer all of the questions, we will try our best to answer them in writing and put them in the FAQ on our website, atlzoning.com. We're going to get started right now by handing the podium over to our newly appointed commissioner. Janae Prince, you have the floor.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. How y'all doing? Who loves zoning? Raise your hand. I'm Janae Prince. I am the new Commissioner of Planning. Been here about 2 months now. I'm really happy to be here, really excited to be here. And I'm really pleased to see so many people in this room tonight and so many people who love zoning. We've got a pretty old zoning ordinance. I guess you all know that, right? It's from 1982. So it's been 40 years and it's time to rewrite the zoning ordinance. Why is this so important? It's really important that we have the tools that we need to be able to implement the plans that we have. Are you familiar with the city design? Yeah, nodding heads. You familiar with the CDP? All right, so then you know how important it is that we're able to implement those plans. And the zoning ordinance rewrite is going to give us the tools to be able to do that. Now, I'm just the person who welcomes you. The stars of the show are right over here. I'm going to hand off to Kieta Holmes. She is the director of the Office of Zoning and Development, and she's going to take over from here.
Good evening, everyone. The department is now at a critical point of workshopping and then drafting the new zoning ordinance. Tonight starts a series of 4 workshops. There will be more workshops to come. The zoning code rewrite will change the language currently found in Part 16. There will likely be a 1-to-1 conversion of existing zoning districts to new zoning districts based upon the discussions that we have tonight and in subsequent nights. Updates to our comprehensive development plan, especially its land use element, will guide zoning map changes in the future. The current zoning ordinance is not frozen in time as we complete the rewrite. So you should expect housekeeping amendments to clean up the code, close loopholes to meet immediate pressing needs. Everyone has a list of their agenda items that they want to have addressed in the zoning ordinance. It could be parking. It could be bike parking. It could be major corridor improvements. It could be multifamily housing in all of its iterations. The zoning ordinance is the tool that the city will use to implement the city's visions and its plans, its small area plans, its corridor plans, all the plans that have been adopted that you all have submitted through the process. Atlanta City Design and the city's 2021 Comprehensive Development Plan, known as Plan A, have very clear policy statements to rewrite the zoning ordinance to support future growth, but in a way that respects Atlanta's unique physical form, history, and most especially its neighborhoods. Since adopting Atlanta City Design into the city's charter in 2017, the department has completed 2 rounds of zoning amendments, one being Quick Fixes Phase 1 and the other being Phase 2. Phase 3 has started with the Idea Labs last fall, and it is a multi-year process of researching, analyzing, and evaluating the best zoning approaches for Atlanta to meet the needs of its current and its future residents. The department will also update the comprehensive development plan to fully support the future zoning ordinance. Updating the CDP has already started with the department and the zoning rewrite consultant team led by TSW. reviewing the technical and legal aspects of the plan against the direction of the new zoning ordinance. This phase of planning work will continue during the zoning workshops and will produce a series of technical memos and policy briefs by early next summer. The initial phase to updating Plan A will provide a clearer understanding of the close connections between the CDP, the vision, and the zoning ordinance, the regulatory tool, and the requisite knowledge of which existing policies and maps in the CDP immediately support implementing the new zoning ordinance and which parts of the CDP must be substantially changed. There are aspects of the current CDP that require no changes to support the anticipated new zoning code when it is adopted, but there are parts that will, the most important being the core plan elements, land use, transportation, and housing. Starting mid-next year, after the zoning workshops, the department will begin engaging the public in a very robust and meaningful planning process over those changes. It is anticipated that this next phase of comprehensive planning work will run concurrently with writing the new zoning code, so Plan A's core plan elements can support the new zoning ordinance when it is adopted in the summer or fall of 2024. Other elements to Plan A will need to be updated, but the work can proceed later in 2024 and into 2025. The department anticipates the full update to the comprehensive development plan will immediately follow the adoption of the zoning ordinance rewrite in 2025. I'd like to thank everyone who is here tonight, all the stakeholders, all residents, all persons that live, work, play, or interact here in the city of Atlanta. Tonight, we will be here until 8:30. We will end promptly at 8:30 to respect your time. Any question that is not answered by 8:30, please reach out to myself or to Caleb via either my email at work or the zoning ordinance rewrite website or an email page. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Director Holmes. Thank you very much, Commissioner Prince. And thank you very much, everyone, both virtually and in person, for joining us tonight in what is truly, in my opinion, as someone who's been practicing city planning in Atlanta for over 20 years, the most important effort that I, as a planner, could possibly work on in the city, the update of the zoning ordinance rewrite. I am part of a much larger team that is led by, let's see if we can get it to advance here, Whitney, by several folks who are both here tonight and with us virtually. The process is being led by TSW. We are an Atlanta-based planning, architecture, and landscape architecture firm, and I'm the project manager for the effort. Joining me is Houston Harris, who you will see around the room later this evening. Additionally, we are very fortunate to have Code Studio as part of our team. They are, in my opinion, the nation's preeminent code writers. They're based in Austin, Texas, but they also do have a small Atlanta office, and Christy Dobson is here representing them. And then, of course, many of our other local partners. You've seen Content Consulting and the great work that they're doing, setting these meetings up and introducing the process and helping us with outreach. We have Aaron Fortner with Canvas Planning helping us, and then a variety of other local partners. Before we get involved with the actual topics tonight, though, I wanted to turn it over to Whitney to make sure that all of our interactive exercises are in fact working. We're very interested in getting a response both from the people who are joining us virtually and also those in the room. So Whitney, I'd like to turn it over to you for a moment.
Thank you, Caleb. We have over 149 people in the virtual room, and actually 155 people in the virtual room as I check again. If you are participating on the Zoom platform, you should see a pop-up window on your screen. We're going to ask our in-person audience to engage in this poll as well. The question we want to know from you is, how did you hear about this meeting? Caleb said before that one of our project team members, Content Consulting, our team has done the best that we could to get the word out, and we want to know how to improve upon that going forward. So I've launched the poll, and you should have the opportunity to engage in the poll right now. The question being, how did you hear about this meeting? Via e-blast.
So if you're e-blast in person, raise your hands out of curiosity, your primary way.
And I'm seeing in the chat that some people
Okay,
are
so
not
we
seeing
got-
the poll.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7.
So I'm going to end the poll. This is just a test.
This is a
Thank
test. This is why
everyone.
we're doing this. So while Whitney's doing that, if you're in the room and you heard about this primarily through an e-blast, please raise your hand and let us count you. Great. 1, 2, 3.
An e-blast is an email.
19, 20, 22, 24, 25, 26, 29. Okay, I have 29 actually 30 in-person folks who heard about it through that way.
And
Yes.
if you see the poll on Zoom, you should be able to select a button on that pop-up screen. I'm not seeing any movement.
Hmm.
And I'm seeing some people are seeing the poll. If you are seeing the poll, we're asking you to participate in it. Okay.
Well,
We're going to try the next poll and come back to that one.
what was that?
And I think we're experiencing a bit of rain, a downpour.
Yeah. Okay, well, Whitney, if we're not going to be able to do it virtually, I'd like to proceed with the content for the folks, if that's okay.
It's perfectly
Okay.
fine. So folks online, thank you for those who are able to see that the poll is working. We're not able to see your results on our end. And we're going to proceed with the rest of the presentation at this point.
Fortunately,
you.
that is the only virtual polling exercise. Everything else will work regardless. So what I wanted to do was to tell you a little bit about what we're going to be doing this evening. I'm going to be talking to you for a little bit about the kind of work that we've been doing since our last meeting, since the Idea Labs, which convened in December of last year. We're then going to really talk about the focus of this process, which is some of the citywide alternatives that we want to hear back from you on, things that may or may not be appropriate for the new zoning ordinance. And then finally, we're going to convene a series of exercises. And those exercises are going to start this evening, but they're actually going to be available for anyone to take online through the website or in person for the next 10 days. And so if you're not able to figure out an exercise, or if you need time to think about it after the meeting tonight, you'll be able to go home, take it virtually at your own time. So next slide. And I also wanted to remind everyone that this is one of 4 workshops that we're going to be hosting. These workshops are intended to build upon the ideas that came out of the Idea Labs and begin to drill down in a bit more detail about concepts that may or may not be appropriate for the zoning ordinance. The first 2 are going to focus on citywide ideas. So things about the general structure of the zoning ordinance, the kind of districts we have, the kind of regulations we may have. And then as we progress, we're going to become more and more detailed, having a meeting in early next year that focuses on the more commercial and growth areas of the city. And then finally, based on all of the feedback received, we'll have another one in early spring focused on the conservation areas. So the idea is to generally go from very big picture to very specific over time. Okay. Next one, Whitney. And finally, before we get into the meat of the presentation, I did want to remind everyone that we have set up several ways for folks to stay in touch with the process. There is the project website, atlzoning.com, where this meeting is being recorded and will be hosted, but where you'll also be able to go right now and see copies of the presentation, copies of all the boards, copies of all the handout materials, and then very importantly, the exercises. So again, as we break into the working groups later on this evening, recognize that you have plenty of time to complete the exercises. We're not expecting all of the decisions, if you will, to occur in the next hour. Everything is going to be focused on the website. We do have, as was mentioned, an email blast set up, atlzoning2@atlantaga.gov. please write us there if you have any questions about the process or recommendations moving forward. And then, of course, if you are interested in watching the meetings, you can also look at them on YouTube. Next. So, as Director Holmes mentioned, zoning is, next one, please. Zoning is the tool that the City of Atlanta uses to determine what may or may not be built on a parcel within the City of Atlanta. Zoning is a tool that is intended to support the various city policies, things like the comprehensive plan, as was mentioned, things like Atlanta City Design, or if you live in a neighborhood that has done a planning process, zoning is often used to codify that particular process. Now, Atlanta's zoning code is over 40 years old. The last time the code was completely rewritten was in 1982, but of course, there have been many, many incremental changes since then. Next. So the zoning ordinance is generally the text of the code. When we talk about zoning, we're really referring to the text of the code, Part 16 of the Code of Ordinances, which contains all of the written standards, all of the written regulations that apply in various parts of the city. Now, we expect as part of the zoning ordinance rewrite that there will be a lot of changes to this part of the code. And that's part of why we're here this evening, is to get feedback on what changes you think are appropriate. However, we all know that the regulations that shape development in Atlanta are more than just a zoning ordinance. So there are things like tree protection, stormwater, stream protection, all of those various ordinances that are technically a different part of the code are very intimately related to what we're doing. And so we're going to coordinate with them on related changes. It was working, so it's not working from up here? Excellent. The second part of zoning that's critical, and I think the part that people tend to be most familiar with, is how zoning actually applies to a particular property. And this occurs through the official zoning map. This is a map at City Hall or on the city's website that shows what individual properties are zoned, what you may or may not build on them. Now, as Director Holmes mentioned, when we typically work on a code rewrite, we like to ensure that the zoning map remains primarily unchanged upon adoption of the new code. And the reason we do that is if you think about how passionate people can get about the zoning changes on one particular property, imagine what would happen if we were literally to change density and use on every property in the city. No American city has been successful in doing that. And so we are hoping to embark really on a two-phase process where we update the text of the ordinance in a way that can meet the needs of various plans that the city has. And then, as Director Holmes mentioned, in the future, as part of the comprehensive plan implementation, that's where the on-the-ground map changes actually occur. And so, again, wanted to remind everyone of that very important relationship. And to really emphasize the fact that as we think about what happens to a particular property, the vision for that property of what the use of the property should be, what the density of the property should be, what kind of character the property should have, is really determined by the CDP, by the Comprehensive Development Plan. The zoning is the tool that implements the vision of the CDP. And as was mentioned, we are working very closely with the comprehensive plan update team to make sure that these two properties or these two projects are engaged, are very closely related. Because as we've got into the effort, we've realized that a lot of what is wrong with the zoning code cannot be changed without also affecting the comprehensive plan and vice versa. So we believe that by looking at these two efforts in tandem, by figuring out the kinds of neighborhoods that people want to legalize in certain parts of the city, the kinds of neighborhoods people want to protect in other parts of the city, those really directly relate to the zoning of the property. And so we're making sure that we're very closely aligned with those efforts. Again, starting later this year, to make sure that the framework, if you will, is consistent. And the thing I wanted to mention too is that zoning rewrites are not fast processes. Typically, they take, at least 4 years. Sometimes some American cities have taken as long as 10. Atlanta is sort of in between those two extremes. We got started, or the city got started in 2016 with the quick fix, with the diagnostic, which really was a roadmap at that time for what kind of zoning changes were appropriate. There were a series of quick fixes, as Director Holmes mentioned, and now we're into the phase 3 of the process, which is grappling with the entire ordinance. We hope that we'll be able to do this in the next couple of years. We will be able to do this in the next couple of years, but it's going to take time. And as I mentioned, we've structured the process where we start very general and go very specific. I know that that's going to be frustrating to a lot of folks who already know what they want, but as we think about the entirety of the city, the entirety of city plans, the interrelated nature of zoning with all of these other city objectives, we've really got to take this at the speed of trust, if you will, to make sure that we're really reflecting what the various communities of Atlanta want. And so that's part of the timing. So with that said, we have been doing quite a few things since the last meeting that have informed where we are this evening. The first thing that we've done as part of the consultant team is a series of technical analysis. We realized very quickly after the Idea Labs that before we had these zoning meetings, we had more work to do. And so we've conducted work looking at things like floor area ratio, or if you will, the density of properties in the city. We wanted to understand how those relate to the actual built patterns of neighborhoods, the plan aspirations of neighborhoods, and sort of what is actually being built today. Are people actually utilizing the full density? And we've done a really thorough analysis of that we're finalizing to post on the project website. Additionally, a lot of what we've done is also look at the permits, the type of permits that the city has issued. Additionally, however, we have put together an updated memo that takes the 2016 diagnostic and makes it current, makes it relevant to the current needs of the city of Atlanta. And it really does that, Whitney, in 3 particular areas. The first thing is looking at how that diagnostic does or does not support the Atlanta city design. The second is developing recommended approaches, which is really what we're here to talk about this evening. And then the final piece, the final new piece, is really focusing on the methods of testing. So with that said, when you look at those documents, which are unfortunately quite long, as zoning documents tend to be, the first one, which is about Atlanta city design, finds that the current zoning ordinance, as we all know, does not fully support the Atlanta city design's core values. I'm sure this is not a surprise to anyone. We have some areas that it supports very well, but we have some other areas, both sort of thematically and physically, that it doesn't. And so we've detailed where the principles of equity, progress, ambition, access, and nature are or are not supported by that document. Additionally, we found that quite a bit of that comes down to the physical framework of the Atlanta city design. If you're familiar with that document, you'll notice that it really breaks the city into 2 types of areas: growth areas, which are intended to be where most of the new growth in the city of Atlanta is expected to occur, whatever the number is. We know that there's one framework in city design, but whatever amount of growth Atlanta is intended to occur is intended to be directed primarily into those areas. But it also focuses on conservation areas. How do we accommodate growth, or how do we preserve character, whichever is most appropriate, in those other parts of the city? And again, it doesn't do that as well as it could. The second thing you'll find in the updated memo is where we talk about how we're going to test this zoning ordinance. And we're not going to go into a lot of this evening, but suffice it to say that what we want to do is we're going to set up a framework where when we begin to actually talk about specific proposed zoning regulations. We want to be able to test how these apply to various sites. Next one. And so we're asking you this evening, if either in person or online, to help us identify, to help us nominate sites in your neighborhoods or other parts of the city that you think would be ideal candidates for testing various zoning concepts. So we're trying to get a very broad cross-section of the city. And we actually have architects on our team who, once we get to the point of actually thinking about regulatory changes, will prepare models showing what it might look like under, the current transitional height plane versus an alternative, or under a setback of this feet versus a modified. And so we're asking folks, if they've always wanted to envision how zoning does or does not affect a property, that there is an opportunity this evening to nominate testing sites that we will test varying zoning concepts on as we go forward. And so we're just asking for you to fill out the sheet. If you would like to do it on the project website using the QR codes, or to email us. And just the final decision will, of course, be made by the Department of City Planning. And then really the meat of that document is the recommended approach. And so in here, you'll find that we are building on the 2017 zoning diagnostic with a series of updated recommendations. And unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on your perspective, this part of the document is really, really long. There are over 130 unique topics. Again, the zoning ordinance is 700-800 pages. And so a lot of stuff in there. But what we've tried to do is identify areas where we want to use these processes to talk about change, which is part of why we need to have 4 meetings to do this, because there's a lot to cover. So that's a little bit about what we have done to date. Before we actually get to the exercises, we wanted to see if anyone has any questions.
Well, Caleb, there are tons of questions and comments online, but I will offer the pleasure of the in-person audience to ask their questions first, and you can do so by making your way to the front of the room, left side of the aisle where the microphone is. We're just asking that you keep your question to about 60 seconds. And Caleb, if you could keep your answer similarly direct. Again, not to take away the depth and importance of the conversation, but to respect our time here tonight. So seeing no one at the microphone as of yet.
We have one.
Please introduce yourself and ask your question.
My name is Amy Stout. I live in NPUN. I hope this is not off topic. Many years ago, we did the nature survey, and it was the introduction to do the tree protection ordinance rewrite. And they said, oh, we have to do all this background stuff first and research. I'm like, and it was just like you said, people know what they want. Why do we have to do all this other stuff first? And long story short, we never got a tree protection ordinance rewrite. Can you speak to that, and or how that might happen here too? Or not?
So our consultant team has already done a ton of research. They have analyzed lots of things. Our legal research team has done a lot of that background work. And we are really at a point where we have come to you all because we are ready to get your opinions and your recommendations so that we can start actually drafting the code. So we will have a code. I am, Caleb is, everyone is committed to a new code. It's going to happen.
But the tree.
Tree protection, there were minor fixes to the tree protection ordinance that were adopted by the CDHS committee today and will go to city council on next week. That's phase 1 of TPO. Phase 2, I think it's underway or will be soon underway. So you'll get another set of larger, more impactful changes to the TPO.
I want to remind the the virtual audience to type your questions in the chat. I noticed that there are quite a few comments. Again, I want to allow you a few moments to ask your questions in the chat. One question is, are there any elected officials in the room and online. And I would like to acknowledge online our honorable council member, Marcy Overstreet.
And in person is Councilmember Norwood.
A question online by George. Is there any consideration for the kinds of transit improvements that will be needed to support density increases?
Yes.
This is why you're the director. Would you like to elaborate?
Sure. So we, one, I can tell you two things. We as a department or departments in the city are meeting quite regularly to make improvements to our processes, how we review documents, how we even permit them, how we apply rules and regulations, the kind of information that we provide to our leadership with regard to how dollars are spent and how we can make infrastructure improvements with the developments that do occur in the city. We do recognize that as the city grows, that there needs to be other improvements made, other considerations made with regard to development itself. And so we as a team actually met a couple of weeks ago to discuss how we could do better in that. With regard to the zoning ordinance rewrite, all of those same persons are a part of the internal working team, and they will be opining on all of the information that is drafted and how those things can be improved with their processes as well.
Very good. Thank you, Kieta. Will you introduce your name, please, and ask us your question?
Yeah, my name is Reed Passmore. I'm a Home Park resident, and my question is about the test sites. Are you looking for parcels? Are you looking for like city blocks? Do they have to be developed?
No, they can be any property that, may redevelop in the next 40 years. Really, any site that you're interested in looking at. Majority may be vacant, but it's by no means required.
And please don't limit those sites, those test sites to places that are not already developed, because we're also interested in adaptive reuse.
What about SPI 16 and 17? Are they in the project?
SPI 16 and 17 are zoning districts, and so they will invariably be included in the new zoning ordinance. We would want to coordinate very closely with Midtown Alliance on what comes out of that very carefully crafted code, but any of the citywide provisions may have implications there.
Hi, my name is Selin Kurgo. I'm a resident of NPUN. I just remember, I guess question and comment. I just remember last year during a lot of the rezoning discussions, brought to NPUs and the votes that were taken during NPUs. I remember a lot of those discussions were derailed by accusations that there wasn't enough public outreach or public awareness through the process. I was just wondering, are there any precautions in place to prevent that from happening through these rewrites? Because I feel like no matter what, someone's going to say there wasn't enough outreach about this. So I just want to make sure that this is not all in vain and that people don't shut it down just because they didn't see the millions of, media or what have you. Thank you.
That does invariably occur during any type of rezoning or entitlement process. We are documenting every bit of engagement that we do through the entire process, so that with the package that is delivered to our city council, that at that time, there will also be a separate package of public engagement detailing the first time we interacted with the community last year in 2021, up until the date that we get ready to submit it to city council for review and adoption.
Thank you.
Thank you both for that question and the answer. A similar question about engagement. Graham asks, how will you ensure this process represents the voices of renters, lower income, non-white, and younger residents who are often not equally represented in this meeting?
Sure, we're reaching out to lots of groups. We have actual social media influencers who are a part of this engagement process, trying to target those exact people who are not always a part of this process. When we talk with the community engagement sub on this particular project, we talked about using other groups, churches, community centers, all kinds of other ways to engage people that are involved in those various aspects of life and community culture. We are having this meeting in a hybrid forum, especially to reach everyone, just those people who are on the run, who may be listening on their phone. So all those ways to reach a larger amount of people.
Also, on that note, we will be publicizing our engagement approach for folks who have that question to actually look up the research and process behind it on our website. Will you introduce yourself?
Yes, I'm Jim Martin, MPUD. A lot of what's in Chapter 16 is definitions of terms. And they're scattered throughout Chapter 16 in many different places, and sometimes they contradict each other, and sometimes terms are used that aren't defined. And in order to have a conversation like the conversation we're having now, especially as we get into more detail, it seems like addressing those definitions, both centralizing them and making sure they're consistent and comprehensive is a thing of paramount importance. I was struck in particular the other day, I was looking for a definition in the Code of Residence, which one would think would be defined somewhere. And I found one definition in a section on burlesque theaters, oddly enough, and that was the only one I could find. So I think, addressing that question of definition of terms is very important.
Correct. And that is one of the things that is on our to-do list, and very closely related to that. We want a single definition section. We also want a single, very specific use definition section. Because as you are very familiar with, Mr. Martin, the use definitions in the city are just all over the place. And so we want to make sure that there is a single location that defines what are the types of uses or what are the groups of uses that we're going to regulate, and then how are those actually defined? What do they mean?
And just to answer your question, Mr. Martin, a residence is iterated as a dwelling in the zoning code right now. It's item number 72, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, I tried it both ways. I found it used synonymously, but defined for neither term. So a residence is a dwelling and a dwelling is a residence, but neither is defined beyond that, as far as I can tell, unless it's near a burlesque theater, in which case you can find quite a bit of detail on it.
It's there. I'll send it to you tomorrow.
Just to help us keep track of sort of time and perspective, I think there are 3 more audience members lined up to ask a question, and there are more questions online, but I want to keep it to the next 6 questions to keep us on time, and we'll have more opportunity to have discussion when we break out into our work session. So question from online asks from Aaron, what is the Department of Planning's action plan for enforcing zoning codes? There's a follow-up. For existing and future uses, enforcing what is permitted is actually being built. Will there be more zoning inspectors hired? To ask that question again, I know it was a little choppy, there were multiple. What is the Department of Planning's action plan for enforcing zoning codes?
The zoning code is enforced by the zoning enforcement officers in the Office of Building. There were a number of zoning enforcement officers hired at the beginning of this fiscal year, if I remember correctly. There's always the request to add more, and I can't say beyond that. We'll put the request in. I can't say if it will be fulfilled or not, but that would be based upon budget.
The middle question, which it seems to be leading to the fact that what is being permitted might be different from what is built, and where does that enforcement happen?
That's also done by our zoning enforcement officers. Should someone feel as though something is not being built according to the approved plans, there is a process to submit that complaint to zoning enforcement through our code busters email or their phone number. And then each time that is submitted, it is an inspector is sent out. There are a number of we are a very large city, so there can be a number of cases, but there is a complaint that is created and an inspector does go out.
Very good, thank you. Will you introduce yourself?
Hey there, my name is Griffin Wasden. I live in MPUW. I'm a civil engineer by training, and my question is actually about the cost of infrastructure. Everybody knows that asphalt, pipes, even the cost of services like police, all those things are rising. And we know that low density development, like the single family home I live in, are deeply, deeply revenue negative. And we're largely being subsidized by low income renters and commercial developments. So I know we have a lot of modern tools to do cost of services analyses versus revenue generated by different development models. And I guess my question is, are you doing a cost of service analysis? And if so, how is that going to inform some of the proposals that we're going to see in the next year?
Very important question, but I do want to remind you, I'm very sensitive to the comments. I think a lot of what you're talking about is how the zoning is actually applied to the ground, which has to do with the comprehensive plan, right? The districts are in many ways neutral. It's where the districts are applied that does bring up questions of, are we investing where we have current infrastructure? Are we utilizing current infrastructure? So, I would encourage that the folks thinking about the comp plan as they proceed with that effort, perhaps that is one of the considerations that they look at. But we're here primarily to talk about the tools that are available to implement the comp plan.
Thank you, Caleb. I'll go to a question online. And before I ask this question from Jacob, I want to acknowledge that there were multiple questions in the chat about representation from people who are not here.
Yes.
So Black communities, brown communities, lower income are less advantaged communities. So I do want to acknowledge that I saw that in the chat. How much weight, this is from Jacob, how much weight does a neighborhood CDP carry when zoning makes recommendations to a developer? How much weight does CDP carry when zoning makes recommendations to a developer?
So that's a very specific question for, it seems like something that was developed in their community. The CDP is the vision or the land use that is adopted for that property. When a recommendation is made by the community, it is presumed that the community is making that recommendation based upon their adopted MPU policies and the adopted plans of the CDP. That is how the staff is making their recommendation. So weighted seems a little bit odd. If the zoning is consistent with the land use, then it's the recommendation of approval.
Jacob, if you want to add to that question or follow up, I'll be looking for that in the chat. Will you introduce yourself?
Sure. Good evening. My name is Neil Davis, and I'm a resident here in NPUN in Reynoldstown. And I'm really interested in how you all will be using the new zoning ordinances, to inform like what is going to happen moving forward. Because when I look at how certain land use is being applied right now, Atlanta's at a really interesting point in its lifespan. Too much is starting to look uniform throughout the city. And personally, I like to travel, and when I go places, they look different. What's happening in Buckhead seems to be happening happening here off of Ponce, which is also happening here off of Bill Kennedy. We're getting Chick-fil-A's right in corners where they're really sticking out like a sore thumb. They don't fit movement-wise, flow-wise, any of that stuff. How do you plan on using zoning to inform like how you start to reshape all of this? Because and also how you plan on using it to facilitate in ways where DOT isn't responsive to things that, infrastructure wise aren't really working, because we have quite a few examples here within our neighborhood that speak to this.
Great question. I would say that there are a couple of ways. Really, one of the main things, and I will be talking about this momentarily, is one of the themes of this zoning ordinance rewrite is improving the predictability of development and the quality of design. And I mean quality of design by the ability of the layout of a project to address transportation needs, to address various needs of the city. I'm not talking about, is it painted red or green? We're talking about, is it urban or is it suburban in the areas where those patterns are or are not appropriate? So some of that is part of what we're going to be asking you for feedback on this evening. The bigger question, however, if it does have to do with drastic land use changes in neighborhoods, such as we're zoned R5 today, we want to be zoned something different. That second piece, I would argue, is really a comprehensive plan question. But we're going to create the tools in the zoning code that we hope, as you'll hear in a moment, can help neighborhoods better preserve desired or existing character. And I do just make them very different because some neighborhoods want to be the way they are. Some neighborhoods want change, and the zoning code needs to accommodate both those spectrums. So it's a little bit of both.
An online question, I think, is asking a similar question in that subject. Tejas asks, will there be consideration of gentle mixed use growth and zoning changes, even in the conservation areas?
Will there be consideration? That will certainly be one of the tools that we talk about for neighborhoods that want it as part of workshop number 4. We know that there are some neighborhoods in the city that are very interested in changing what they have now, but they don't want to densify too much. We would be irresponsible to not create a tool for those areas that want to do that, to have the tools to do it.
Perfect. And we have one more in person.
But the mapping
question.
exercise is a comp plan mapping question.
Oh, okay, we're coming there next.
Sweet. Go ahead. Cool. My name is Taylor. It's more of a comment than anything. I live in Midtown Garden District. Love it, by the way, if anybody's over there. I guess a little bit of background. I was a Georgia State student and started serving on NPUM on the board at 2015. So I lived and experienced firsthand a lot of the things you are talking about. And I'm honestly gonna have to like dust off some agendas to just catch up on all the acronyms and things like that. But it's more of a comment of, you know, when you're going around outreach wise to different areas, communities, socioeconomic standings, there is generally a giant knowledge gap around what zoning even is and how it affects you and how you get a stop sign so that your kid isn't getting hit by a car. Like, so I think, I mean, this is the first time I've been here, but I really hope that there is extra effort given to, I feel confident in saying, Black communities that are often left out of this process, because even all of us here have some sort of privilege to be here. And I kind of find myself always speaking for the people I don't think would be in the room or couldn't make it. And so that's what I think I would hope for them, is that there is, for every meeting that you give to an affluent neighborhood that is very active in the MPU, that you give 2-3 meetings to neighborhoods that are new to this type of engagement, especially around topics as dense as CDPs and, you know, every other acronym we're throwing around. So, yeah.
Caleb, Kieta.
So I grew up here in Atlanta, off of MLK. And when I drive down MLK today, it is exactly the way it was when I went to elementary school. So I am very cognizant of reaching out to communities of color, and helping them to understand what entitlement is, what zoning is, what land use is. While we adopted the tagline, zoning affects everything. We are very intentional about reaching out to those communities of color, and helping them to understand FAR and density. It's what we do with our NPU University. It's what we do with every piece of engagement that we have in the Department of City Planning. It is why all of the department directors in the Department of City Planning meet regularly and talk about how each of the things that we are working on all interact with each other, and how we have to make sure that the communities, not only the communities of affluence, but the communities of non-affluence, are brought along, moving forward, with everyone moving forward in Atlanta. So I really hear you. I really thank you for that comment. And please know that we are very intentional about bringing everyone along with us.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'll add a couple of things to that and ask one question from the virtual audience before we move on. That just want to acknowledge you. I think, Taylor, for your role in making sure that you're representing people that you think are not in the room. And I would just ask the same of that, of everyone who is in this in-person room and in this virtual room. A meeting isn't going to be the way that we reach everyone. The way that we reach everyone is if you actually call or text someone who isn't here tonight that you think should be a part of the conversation, and make sure that they just have access to the video, that you talk about things that you know are important to them. So thank you for that, Taylor, for showing how that happens. The last question from the virtual audience, David asks, Atlanta has notoriously dangerous streets and aggressive drivers. Will the zoning rewrite prioritize pedestrian safety?
The zoning ordinance legally does not affect the public right of way. It is primarily about private property and the required public improvements that a development must make adjacent to their property. So if you look across the street, we all know what Memorial Drive looked like 10 years ago. These projects have had to put in sidewalks. They've put in, improvements in some areas. Unfortunately, the bigger transportation network is something that zoning cannot regulate. We can do things that will benefit it. For example, walkable development patterns, greater street connectivity, interconnectivity, trail connections. But at the city level, that's more of an Atlanta DOT effort.
Very good. Thank you, Caleb. Thank you, everyone who is online, 163 participants right now. If we didn't get to your question again, follow the website and look for answers in the FAQ.
Great. All right. Thank you very much, Whitney. And thank you, everyone, for sticking with us. I want to now talk about some of our alternatives that we're going to ask for you to consider this evening. And as was mentioned by several folks, it's very important that the questions that we're about to ask for feedback on, that you take your time as you consider them, you think very carefully about them, and very importantly, you let other folks know that we've set up this wonderful website where everything can be reviewed and commented on and provide feedback in the coming weeks. And so what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about the alternatives of the first section that we've put together for your consideration this evening. Those are obviously informed by all the work to date and effectively fall in the categories of problems and then potential alternatives that we want your feedback on. Now, I wanted to remind everyone that as we talk about alternatives, next one, oh, it does work? There we go. Perfect. As we think about alternatives, we also want you to consider some of the issues that were brought up tonight, the current needs of the city. And as educated citizens, I would encourage everyone not only to think about themselves, but also about their neighbors and those who are not in the room. I think that's a challenge that I would like to give to all as you think about these recommendations. Future needs, again, that may be not only us, but our children. Zoning codes are updated every 30 to 40 years typically. So this new ordinance is going to be with Atlanta for many years. I'd like you to think about city plans, especially the CDP, especially neighborhood plans. And then absolutely central to all of this, and I think you've got a sense of this evening, is this idea of trade-offs. Zoning is the regulation of property. And every decision that supports one public policy, one public goal, can have a negative impact on another public goal. So as you think about these decisions, think about, well, what do they mean for design? What do they mean for housing affordability? What do they mean for tree protection? What do they mean for carbon impacts? What do they mean for economic development? Really try to think about every decision from a macro perspective. And then, of course, keep with that in mind, we have specifically given you alternatives that are in conflict. Don't think we haven't done that on purpose, because we want you to help us come up with a way to hopefully reconcile some of these tensions that are not only Atlanta specific, they're issues that every American city is dealing with. And then to remind everyone, that this is the first part of a process that is going to be at least a year of input, if not longer, before we have a draft code. So in terms of the problems, and I'm going to go through these really quickly because these are intended to inform the exercises that you'll do after. The first one is that the zoning code does not always result in the development that city and neighborhoods want, especially in the pre-World War II neighborhoods. We've talked about it. You're aware of it. The zoning code we have today is very good at creating suburban development in most areas. That is what its DNA is from. The 1982 zoning ordinance does a great job in R3, great job in R2, doesn't work as well in some of the other areas. And so that is implicit to who we're dealing with. It's what was happening in the 70s when the actual code was written. Additionally, we believe that because of that, we need to take a completely new approach to the zoning ordinance. And for those of you who attended the 4th Idea Lab last year, we threw out this idea that I'm going to turn over to Christy to present very briefly, called zone strings. This is a tool where we can actually structure the zoning code so that it can provide literally hundreds of opportunities to implement neighborhood plans without having to create a customized zoning district for every specific neighborhood. Christy, would you like to talk a little bit about that? The reason I put this first, by the way, is because the feedback in December was extremely positive, not only from the attendees, but I heard them talking about it at City Council. I heard them talking about it all over the city. So we got really, really good feedback on that. And we want to ask you this evening, do we have permission to move forward with that approach? Christy, you want to talk about it?
Caleb. Can we get this to work? So zone strings, how is that fundamentally different from how we think about districts today, right? So we're all sort of familiar with our conventional districts. We have our residential sort of R1, R2, R3 up to R5, our commercial districts, and we even have some quality of life districts, you know, our MRCs, our mixed use residential commercial districts. And, you know, as we think about zoning, and as Caleb really laid out beautifully, we have these different contexts that exist within our city, but we don't necessarily have the tools, even though we have over 200 zoning districts. When we think about historic districts, SPIs, our conventional districts, we don't necessarily have the tools we need to address all the different contexts we have in the city. So we end up sort of trying to modifying them a little bit here and a little bit there. And we end up with, and as one of the questions I think brought up and really set us up well for this conversation, you know, a district can define a use one way in this historic district and a different way in this SPI and a different way in this conventional district. And it ends up being pretty confusing, both as a neighborhood resident trying to figure out what you can do on your property or someone trying to administer the code. And so what zone strings would allow us to do is really think about the nuance that things like the historic districts and our conventional districts are really trying to get at. But it actually allows us to address the context that we have that we love and we want to preserve, or in some instances, maybe want to move toward in our city. So that's our context. You know, we understand that, we look at that from a planning level, but really we need to think about the zoning districts, which I'll sometimes refer to as our zoning tools. We want to get those tools right. And fundamentally, you know, when we talk about zoning, whether it's conventionally or zone strings, we think about controlling the built environment in these sort of 4 buckets. The first bucket being the form of the building. So let's say a house form. Looks like a house, feels like a house, but that's just the form of the building. It has to do with how tall it is, how wide the building is, maybe if it has a pitched roof or not. But it doesn't really say anything else about what's happening in the building or how it relates to the street. It's just what the building is from a bulk and massing perspective. The next piece that we control in zoning is frontage. And frontage is that relationship between the public realm and the private realm. So how does that building sit along the street? What does the sidewalk look like? Is it a really wide sidewalk because it's a more urban environment? Or maybe it's a little bit thinner of a sidewalk with a big tree lawn because it's more suburban or more rural. And so that definition of how the building addresses the street, that's our frontage. And it's that relationship between the public and private realms. And that's a different context. So if you think of a house, you know, a form, it can be more rural and be set further back, or it can be in a more urban context and set further forward. Still the same form, different frontage. And then we think about the site elements. So these are the sort of softer things that sort of happen around the building. How much parking do we need to provide? It may be a different context. If that house form, if it's next to a MARTA station with good transit access, you probably don't need to provide quite as much parking as if it would be somewhere further out that maybe is more car dependent. So we want to think about those site elements differently depending on the different contexts. And then that really, those three items are what we think about as we build our tools for the built form. And then we also think about use and zoning, right? That's the other important piece. So what can happen inside of that structure and as it sits on a site? Even though it looks like a house, feels like a house, you know, whether it's in a more urban or suburban context, we know a lot of instances that there are actually businesses that exist in those buildings. And so that's a different use package than somewhere that may be just a single dwelling. And then some neighborhoods may say, hey, yeah, it looks like a house, feels like a house, but maybe I'm okay with 2 or 3 different families living in it. And so that's where use comes in. And what the difference would look like in our conventional districts, so we're using R5, for example. So what our conventional districts do is they sort of batch all of those things together. And so it says, if you're R5, you're pre-prescribed for your form, your frontage, your site, your use. You get what you get, right? It's all baked into R5. But what we know is even though there are different neighborhoods that are R5 in the city, they have different contexts, they feel different. And we need to have different tools that address those separately. So what the zone string does is it breaks those up into different modules and allows us to turn those dials in a way that responds to separate contexts. So it's not just R5. One neighborhood may have a house scale with a neighborhood frontage that allows for the house to be a little bit closer up. And maybe there's some commercial units in there. Whereas another neighborhood may say, no, I still want the house form. I still want it to be a little bit more urban, but that's not the use package I want. Or maybe we need to provide more parking here. And so the zone string really allows us to turn those dials in a specific way that responds to the context of our plans that we've laid out in our master plans and that we've laid out in our comprehensive development plans. And what was fun about this, so, you know, we have worked on this nationally, this idea of zone strings in other communities. And as Caleb got into it, he said, hey, this is actually what Atlanta did back in the 1920s. So it's kind of that idea of like every idea is new and old at the same time. So it was a very similar idea where we essentially had 3 height districts, we had 4 use districts and 5 area districts, and they fundamentally made 60 different combinations. So it really adds that flexibility in a way it's also predictable and it's more nuanced and context driven. So everything that's old is new again.
Great. Thank you, Christy. So one of the first exercises is going to be asking if you think that's a good idea, if we have your permission to go forward with the idea of zone strings. And we feel that it's such an important tool because it does address potentially the second biggest problem with the zoning ordinance, that it does a very poor job of reflecting neighborhood patterns without going through an expensive process of writing a historic district or writing an SPI or writing another unique zoning tool. And so there are ways that that zone string approach can actually be tailored to better reflect neighborhood patterns. We can do it by actually coding for the physical form that's there in areas that want to preserve that physical form. Things like setback, lot size. We can even look at perhaps coming up with a tool that allows us to legalize what are called non-conforming lots. What this basically means is that when Atlanta's neighborhoods were laid out in the, primarily 1900 to about 1950, they have lot sizes that don't actually match the zoning code. And so if you're a non-conforming lot, you have a zoning code that may not be written for a lot that actually reflects your size. And so you need to go through a variance process. In Decatur, Code Studio and I actually went and defined by a sliding scale what your setbacks could be. So if you were a narrower lot, you got a narrower side setback and a different lot coverage. And so the sliding scale may be a tool that could be used. Okay, next one. Additionally, the idea is that even though they don't reflect the form pattern, but they also do not reflect the use pattern. And again, there's a difference. The form is the building. The use is what is within the building. So you all know this property, Inman Park, lovely, lovely, lovely building. And Atlanta used to build a lot of that stuff. It was actually legal in one of the early zoning codes, but that kind of development pattern is not legal everywhere. And so if we wanted to, if there were neighborhoods that wanted to allow corner stores or wanted to allow greater home occupation, for example, the zone string approach could in fact do that. We could pre-build the zoning ordinance to allow those kind of things in neighborhoods that wanted them going forward. Additionally, we believe that if the zone string concept is something that has merit, there may even be communities that would like to be pilot areas for some of these ideas. Again, nothing is set in stone at this point in time. Most of the map changes will come out of the comp plan, but we know that some neighborhoods are really, really, really anxious to move forward. Someone mentioned, the gentleman in the back, that he lives in the Midtown Garden District. You know, I know that Midtown Neighbors has been struggling with a better tool for matching that pattern. You know, those kind of places, or South Atlanta, or even, you know, parts of West End, they may be potential pilot areas. And so one of the things that we're asking you is, if you can think of parts of the city this evening that there may be neighborhood support for some of these concepts 2 to 3 years down the road when the zoning ordinance is written, let us know now so that we can have that in the back of our mind if we think about, in fact, implementing pilot areas going forward. Additionally, the other problem with the zoning ordinance is it doesn't do a very good job at prescribing how the building relates to the street in a predictable way, especially where that neighborhood character is important. And so one of the alternatives to remedying that could be, in fact, codifying better what we call the frontage, or really where a property meets the street. Atlanta uses that today, but it's not actually called that, but it could be a great part of the zone string. We could do that. Can you go back, Whitney? I think it's going a bit fast. And we could do all of that, as Christy mentioned, via a context-based approach. I would argue that one of the biggest problems with the Atlanta zoning code is it treats some regulations the same, regardless of if you're in downtown or you're in an R1 property, you know, by the Chattahoochee River. And this idea of a zoning code that better responds to neighborhood context, the urban, the suburban, and the rural by intention, is something that's really important. Frontages, we already talked about this one. We already talked about that one. Additionally, one of the things we may be able to incorporate into the idea of zoning strings is other standards, right? We know that we're probably not going to regulate architectural style because that's not what zoning is about. It's more about the form and placement of buildings. But if there are unique patterns in certain neighborhoods that emerge from this process that we should be considering, let us know that those are important to you through that survey question. The second big topic that we wanted to talk about is parking decks. Someone mentioned Midtown. When the zoning ordinances were updated about 10 to 15 years ago, the sort of state of the art was to create parking decks with active ground floor uses. And so all of the newer zoning districts do a pretty good job of that. You can't really build a parking deck along the street and have a blank area. But as the city has grown, we've heard more and more interest in thinking about what happens above, about things like, going forward, things like ground floor uses again. Is that sufficient? Or in some neighborhoods, there's interest now in actually requiring active uses above the first floor. They actually have a requirement in downtown Atlanta where you have to build the first 2 to 3 stories of active uses, and then above that, your parking deck can be in. So we're going to ask if that may be a tool that we look at creating. If we think about adaptable parking, you know, requiring parking decks that convert to other uses. Very expensive, very challenging, but now is the time to at least see if there's interest in it so that we can know if we should or should not incorporate it. Related to that, buried parking. Again, extremely, extremely, extremely expensive. And one of those things that can run contrary to affordable housing goals or affordable retail goals. But again, it would be inappropriate of me not to throw that out because I know that some neighborhoods are talking about it. And then, of course, this idea of what does it mean to screen parking? Right now, there is one standard in chapter 28 or part 28 of the zoning code, chapter 28, that applies everywhere. We may have an opportunity to massage that a little bit. So there might be slightly different standards in some parts of the city that are urban, where maybe you don't want it just surrounded by landscaping, but in rural areas or suburban areas, that may be appropriate. Next one. Now, another problem with the zoning code is the way the code regulates density, and that is primarily through what we call floor area ratio. Floor area ratio, next Whitney, is effectively the floor area of a building. So say 100,000 square foot building divided by its lot size. That gives you a number. It's a very good indicator of how much stuff can fit on a property, but not a good indicator of what the design looks like. I use the example of the Bank of America Tower being an FAR of 8, tallest building in the city. William Oliver Building right at Peachtree Street in 5 Points is 17 stories, is an FAR 15. So again, FAR doesn't really regulate alone. It's about the size of the lot and the design of the building. And so here are again some examples. An FAR on 100% lot coverage of FAR 2 could be 2 stories. And then as you become narrower, as you go smaller, the number remains the same, but the form can be very different. So we ask you, if we think about creating a code that's more predictable, perhaps this is an area we look at changing. Another challenge with FAR, and this is a big one in my opinion as a code writer, is the Atlanta zoning code was highly prescriptive in terms of determining whether buildings in commercial and mixed use areas like Memorial Drive should be commercial or residential. And they actually prescribed different densities so that, for example, if I was building an 8-story building, I would have one density if it was an office building, and I would have a different density if it was residential. And it's a little bit arbitrary in my opinion, but it's a really bad indicator of the form. And what it also does is it means that a lot of our corridors today are zoned for far more commercial use than the city will ever need. But they're zoned for very little residential. And so as Atlanta's in a housing crisis, it might be time to think about how can we change that if at all. And here's an example. This is the Piedmont Road corridor up near Cheshire Bridge Road. The first diagram shows the residential density. And so you can see it's very concentrated at Piedmont and Cheshire Bridge. That breaks off very quickly to the neighborhood areas in the distance. The second one shows the commercial density. You can see that the commercial density is much higher. Someone could basically go and build a skyscraper in those areas if it was an office building, but they can't build very much housing at all. And so when you combine them, you actually get a different number. And so one of the things we're interested in hearing from you is whether or not that makes sense, whether we should be so prescriptive in defining density based on what is in the building, or whether what matters more is just the size of the building. Next one. So the other thing is that related to that, our zoning districts densities are very arbitrarily precise. Next one. If you've ever looked at the zoning code, you will see that floor area ratio numbers go out to the 1,000th decimal place, meaning my density may be 1.696. Now I'm a planner. I work with zoning every day, and I can tell you that it is impossible to look at a building and determine if the density is 0.696 versus 0.7. So one of the things we would propose in creating a zoning ordinance that's easier to use is just making sure that these numbers actually make sense, that they actually reflect meaningful differences in density and meaningful outcomes in terms of supporting neighborhood plans. Parking is also a challenge in the way that Atlanta treats density today. This is a apartment building with about 4, maybe 12 floors of parking going up across from my office. But interestingly enough, the actual density of that property doesn't begin until the upper story. Atlanta does not count parking decks in density. And so it's a very poor indicator of the actual form of the development. And that's quite unusual, in fact, for American cities. Most of them do count parking. And so again, if we're thinking about FAR, if we're thinking about making sure that all these numbers make sense, maybe that gets work, maybe it doesn't. That's what we're asking you to provide feedback on. And then, of course, the density challenge, the FAR challenge is not only in the midtowns or the downtowns, it's also in some of the neighborhoods. In some neighborhoods, accessory dwelling units count towards density. In some zoning districts, they don't. So for goodness gracious, if we're rewriting the zoning code, we want to be at least consistent. We would hope in terms of what counts, what doesn't count, don't have this variability by different districts. And so finally, there is a question is about whether or not we have your permission, if you will, to look at updating some or all of these FAR numbers, because they are one of those central pieces of the zoning ordinance that does not work as well as it should. Including whether or not we want to make it easier to convert residential, or should I say commercial buildings into residential and vice versa in the areas that are zoned for it, obviously not in the areas that are not zoned for it. Additionally, do we think about what counts? What should count, what shouldn't count in FARs? And closely related to that, how do we work with bonuses, right? We know that there are things that the city wants to achieve that for legal reasons, you can't always mandate. We have a state constitution and we have a national constitution that do impact what cities across the country can do. But one of the ways you can get around that, if you will, is by creating incentives. And Atlanta has a lot of that today. Some zoning districts have incentives for additional open space, affordable housing, creation of new streets. And so bonuses are a really important tool that we could look at. Related to that is the issue of height. If you think the FARs are arbitrary in the zoning ordinance, look at the height. Next one, Whitney. They are equally as arbitrary. You have some districts that have a 28-foot limit, which may make sense for a house, a lot with 32, and then, or a few with 32, and then one with 35. And again, once you get into the downtowns, the midtowns, the Buckheads, the Ponce de Leon Avenue corridors, the Memorial Drive corridors, it's really hard for anyone who is not an AI, if you will, to look at a building and tell me whether it's 72 feet versus 75. The numbers are absolutely meaningless from an impact perspective. Additionally, in our commercial and our mixed use areas, the zoning actually does not always encourage the creation of viable commercial spaces. Because we have building heights that are fixed, a lot of times what developers will do in order to try to get as many floors as possible is they'll make the floors really low, especially if they're a multifamily developer and they don't actually care about creating viable retail that the developers are encouraging. And this is more of a problem outside of the commercial cores. And so we would ask you, do we get rid of the incentive that penalizes people for putting ground floor retail by then making floors that are 9 to 10 to 11 feet tall? I know we have a retail broker in the room, and I'm sure she would agree that 16, 18, 20 feet is really good for quality retail space. And so that's the kind of thing that we could think about in the zoning code. Next one. And then, of course, the zoning code does not do a very good job thinking about topography. And this is the lovely townhomes that were built on North Side at Deering. So from a zoning perspective, that building is 35 feet tall, because height is measured from grade, but it's 15, 20 feet above the street. And so one of the things that we could think about, if it's important, is better aligning building height, especially as it impacts the street and it impacts adjacent uses, to consider topography. And then related to that is this idea of just making sure that the numbers are meaningful when possible, that we take out disincentives to viable ground floor commercial uses. Next one. And that we can think about regulations that might better relate to topography. This is actually a Code Studio graphic, next one, where one of the codes they're working on requires large buildings, meaning buildings that are 400, 500, 600 feet wide, to actually step with topography so that they create a more human scale and they don't result in quite as much mass grading. Next one. Finally, the other problem that we see is that the way that the zoning code transitions between higher intensity and lower intensity doesn't always reflect the needs of neighborhoods. Next one. It does that in a couple of ways. Buffers or transitional yards are used. Height is used in other areas. And then there are even what we call transitional uses today. That current approach, again, is in some ways really that current approach is also tied to the idea of how much open space is actually required in parts of the city. It is highly unpredictable, confusing, inconsistent, and very importantly, it doesn't always result in meaningful open spaces. And so if you've ever looked at the zoning code, you would know that this beautiful parking lot at the Beacon in Grant Park is actually open space. It counts as the total open space required in the city of Atlanta. So I ask you, should our zoning code do that? And of course, should that occur in a way that ties to context, to recognizing that there are various parts of the city that we can think about requiring different amounts of open space. And then of course, we could think about incentives for various open space requirements. So in a nutshell, that is an overview of the kind of things that we're going to ask for your feedback on this evening, either in person here or virtually. And so what we have done is we have set up 2 opportunities tonight to participate. If you are in the room with us, and if you have your smartphone, you can go to any of the stations that interest you. They're lettered A to H, but you can go to whichever is interesting to you personally. You can point at the QR code and you can select the topic, read the boards, and then answer there. It's set up so that you can choose to only do one tonight and then go home and do the remainder on your website. But for those of you with a phone, that's probably the easiest way to do it. For those of you who are not comfortable with a phone and who are here this evening, we also have about 50 printed handout booklets, and they are booklets. They're 20 pages because we've got a lot of content we want feedback on that you can also go around, you can fill it out, and then you can leave it in the box here this evening. Additionally, we want you to really think very carefully about these. Some of the questions that we're about to ask you are pretty nuanced, somewhat complicated, and you may need time to think about. So as I've mentioned, the exercises this evening and the presentation are going to be available to provide feedback on up until December 9th. If we get a lot of requests to extend it, we can always extend it a little bit, but we're hoping we give people a good 10 days to do it. And those are at atlzoning.com. And then finally, as I mentioned, on that project website, all of the materials are there this evening. And then finally, before I turn it over and we talk about the online portion for the exercises for the folks who are there, we know that there may be things on your mind that do not neatly fall into one of the categories we've talked about this evening. We are going to talk about a lot more at the next meeting. We're going to talk about stuff like the amount of parking required and how do we better engage transit and, you know, the sign ordinance and all of these other things. But feel free to use a comment card, to write it down, to put it in the box here, or again, to send an email to the Atlanta Zoning website for further comments. So next one, Whitney, if we could. So again, that is available at atlzoning.com. You can email me and Director Holmes at atlzoning2@atlantaga.gov. And then of course, review all of this on YouTube. Are there any technical questions about what we're doing before we break. And we'll be, for those of you online, we'll be giving you directions on how to participate there momentarily. Okay. Yes.
So can we just, if we just leave now, we can do it online?
Yes, if you want to leave now, you can go home and do it online. Absolutely. For those of you who do want a printed copy, Elijah and Houston, who were at the sign-in table, they have copies for a printed version, but I'm sure a lot of you, if you want to do the QR code, you know how that works. You point it at the image and it brings up the website. Any other technical questions before we break? And
Virtual audience, in-person audience, please join me in a round of applause for our speakers.
Next one. Before.
I'm going to hang back in the room for our virtual audience. We're going to take you on the website, Social Pinpoint. My colleague Alana will be sharing her screen momentarily. Please stay with us or take a break if you need to online. Our in-person room is just breaking out to their breakout session. Alana and Yinka, our producer, I'm handing it over to you.
Can you switch it so that we can see that?
Hi, everyone. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Okay, so just as Caleb went over everything, we've set up the focus workshops so that your input opportunities are identical, whether you're attending in person, online live, or online over the next 10 days that this survey is available. The content of this workshop has been divided into 8 topics that are usually regulated in some way around the city of Atlanta. Remember, at this point in the process, we're trying to gauge support for general zoning concepts before our code writers prepare specific zoning standards for your future consideration. As you take the survey, please consider whether the zoning concept might be a useful take to have anywhere in Atlanta, even if it might not be appropriate for your neighborhood. Our code writers will be coming back to you at focused workshops number 3 and 4 with more specific alternatives for how those concepts might or might not apply in different areas. With that said, let's get started with the directions of this survey. So first, this is what you are going to see when you click on the link to the survey. And if you go to the How to Participate tab right here, and this will always be here, this has all the instructions that you need. If you decide to take this later and you have questions, you can find all the answers here. So first, we would like everyone to be familiar with their NPU they most closely identify with. So, and please remember your NPU because you will need it in the survey. And I will just give you an example of how to find that. One moment. So if you need to find it, go right here where it says need to find your NPU and click the City of Atlanta Property Information Viewer. It will take you to a new tab and you scroll down and go to Property Info and you'll click that. And it will take you to this map. And here you will type in your address. I will type in my office address just as an example. And it will pull up the location and it will show the NPU of that address. So just remember that and then go back to the survey. And then another thing that I want to show you all how to use is how to draw a potential test site. So right here, there's this little icon that says potential test site. You can drag this on the screen anywhere that you would like to see a test site at the next meeting, and you will actually draw the parameters of this. So this is just a test. And then you have to click on the last point to finish. It can be a little bit tricky, so you might have to click a few times to get it. And here you will just write your comment, input your email, and then you can put your first name and last name, but it is not required. So that is up to you. And then you just press add comment, and then it will appear. And the same goes for ideas and suggestions. You will drag this to a specific area that you want to see something. you write your comments, you input your email, and then you can put in your phone number, your zip code, or your first and last name. And then you can press add comment. And then you will be able to see all other people's comments, and you can like and dislike it, or you can start a discussion. So you will be able to comment on other people's ideas and suggestions, which is a cool interactive experience of this survey. So you can continue to stay online with Zoom to take the survey if you so please to, but there is actually nothing else that will be covered in the meeting on Zoom. I will stay on for the next 20 minutes to answer questions for people in the chat. But you can sign out if you like to take the survey. It's pretty in-depth, so you might have more time to go do that. You can come back later and take the survey, and it will be available through December 9th. So again, you don't have to take it all tonight. It will be open through for the next 10 days. And the boards and video, the boards that are in the in-person meeting and the video of recording of tonight will be posted to the project website within a few days. And just a reminder, send any additional questions that you have to the Atlanta zoning email, and I will drop that email address into the chat right or momentarily.